And when Alexander Volkanovski not only showed that he had better striking in the first fight, the second fight, and then the freaking third fight, how could you not freaking say that, yeah, dude, this guy's striking is on another level? The dude used to play rugby at 215 pounds. I said it once and I'll say it again, but he ran through people. Literally ran through people. This isn't your ordinary jiu-jitsu practitioner who's used to rolling and scrambling. Nah, this dude is slam. This dude is run straight through you and keep on going. He's got a non-stop pace. Welcome to the Kevin Hoop Show. We're going to be going over UFC fights here. We're going to be going over mixed martial arts in general. Maybe some boxing, maybe some jiu-jitsu, grappling. Going to be going over all mixed martial arts in general. Now, some of you might be asking, well, I'm down to watch that. When is it going to get uploaded? Every damn Monday. That is when, all right? Now, again, I am your host, Kevin Hoops. I am a male because you have to say what kind of gen you are every time you get introduced to someone, because that's just the type of time we live in today. But yeah, that's me, a little bit about me. What about the podcast / show that I'm going to be coming out with every Monday again? And yeah, I'm a big UFC fan. I've been a fan for probably the past 5 to 6 years now. And, you know, I started to get into jiu-jitsu myself. I used to wrestle a little bit back in middle school, probably for 4 years, almost 4 years, 3 to 4 years I wrestled for school. And next thing you know, I just really always was interested in fighting and MMA in general, more specifically grappling in the wrestling aspects because that's what my background was. But up until this year, I've always wanted to get into it, and do it myself. And this year, I finally pulled the trigger, and I'm rolling on the mats myself, doing some jiu-jitsu. And honestly, it's really fun. And one of the reasons why I want to make this podcast, just because I'm learning about the game slowly but surely, and just want to really make a podcast about it and see what I see in these UFC fights that I can kind of show and share with the similarities that I see in my own type of journey in jiu-jitsu right now. But yeah, with that long intro, we're going to get right into this podcast or this show where we're going to be really talking about some upcoming fights that we have in the next upcoming month or two. So right now I'm recording this. It is the week of Thanksgiving. So happy Thanksgiving, number one. Happy freaking Thanksgiving if you're listening to this and it's, Thanksgiving's coming up. So, we've got the turkey freaking legs coming Thursday. They are coming. And with that, I believe a week or two after that, we have the December 10th card for the UFC. And that is Jiri Prochazka. I'm not even going to try and pronounce the last name. But we've got Jiri versus Glover Teixeira. I didn't even really watch that much of the first fight, and I just rewatched it recently, and it was fucking one of the most entertaining fights I've watched all year. In my opinion, the beginning of this year was a little slow with really entertaining fights, and now it's fucking banger after banger after banger. We're seeing KO, KO, KO. The beginning of the year was decision, decision, decision. So I'm liking where it's going. I'm not going anywhere in that direction. I don't know if the first fight was in the beginning of the year. It might have been, so I could be speaking wrong. But yeah, that fight was really a really good fight. I want to say it was back in the summertime, but it also might have been in the spring, so not 100% sure on that one. But that's a fight coming up, and the January card as well is, I think, in the beginning of January, but that one's not even filled yet. There isn't a main card for that date as of now, as of a month and a half beforehand, a month and 10 days beforehand. So not really too sure what's going to be going on with January, but February we've got a banger, and we just saw him fight about a month ago in October, and it's Islam Makhachev versus Alexander Volkanovski, for those of you that didn't know. And what a fight he had in October with Charles Oliveira. Just absolutely dominated him within the first 2 rounds. And then he ended the fight with like a minute into the second round. Crazy. I don't understand how he's propelled himself so higher than everyone else when it comes to grappling, and I just don't understand how he's done that. He showed great striking. He showed great kind of on-hand decision making. He had to decide when he clocked Charles Oliveira and had him stunned if he was going to continue the fight standing or if he was going to continue the fight on the ground. And you don't see that out of fighters until after they have the belt and are a little bit more experienced, especially in those 5-round fights. And we didn't see that at all. He made that decision right away and finished the fight with ease. With ease. But yeah, I also want to talk about Volk. Alexander Volkanovski, I think we're all forgetting each time he's fought. Because there's been multiple times, especially against Max Holloway, where I had my money on Max. I'm a big Max Holloway fan in general. And after the first one, I became a big Alexander Volkanovski fan. But still in the back of my head, I thought no one was comparable to Max's boxing. I thought Max Holloway's boxing was on another level, and he was going to be changing the game almost with it. And not, straight boxing, but mixed martial arts striking. And when Alexander Volkanovski not only showed that he had better striking in the first fight, the second fight, and then the freaking third fight, how could you not freaking say that, yeah, dude, this guy's striking is on another level? And he comes from a background in rugby. The dude used to weigh 215 freaking pounds. And now he's going up in weight? I think that only suits better for him. I think that his boxing is looking absolutely phenomenal. I don't think Islam will have much of an answer for him there. But then you also see his grappling is pretty fucking good. When you defend against 3 different submissions from Brian Ortega, who's a black belt in jiu-jitsu, you're not just some Joe Schmo off the road who's going to freaking maybe get a lucky headlock in or something like that to a takedown. No, this dude knows when he's going to get put into a submission and figures a way out. And a big thing I know people can compare, Islam has beat Charles. Charles has that background in jiu-jitsu. But the thing that Charles also, I think, he's already lost before. He's more of a jiu-jitsu practitioner where tapping is a little bit more not practiced. Well, it's definitely practiced. But a lot of people have the mentality, even in jiu-jitsu, that when you get put into a position, let the partner go for it and let them, and you tap, just practicing. It's that very, very nice, good partner type of practice that you want to have with someone when you're kind of sparring. Now, I'm not saying that that's why Charles Oliveira tapped for the freaking belt. He had the belt on the line. There's no way he's just going to be like, oh, yeah, he got it. I'm going to tap and I'll fight him tomorrow. No. But I think when you get put into that sort of situation with all that pressure on you, and you may not be thinking exactly the way you'd be thinking if you were sparring, and sometimes you're going to tap compared to if you were in that sparring, or sometimes you wouldn't tap compared to if you were in the sparring session and you're going to tap. And that's where I think Alexander Volkanovski has that mentality. He'll tap in practice, but when it comes to the freaking fight, this dude is going to die out there. He will get his arm broken. He will get choked out. He's not going to just give up, which is what we've seen Charles do. I'm not saying the dude completely gave up, but he tapped. And some people have a mentality when they enter that octagon that no matter what position they get put into, they're not going to tap. You look at it with Dan Hooker in his last fight, what fight was that? I forget who he just fought, but the guy, it was Carlito Pullos. He's a very big jiu-jitsu person, at least on the ground. And Dan Hooker said, if he puts me in a leg lock, I'm just going to let him break my leg. I know it's going to happen. So let him break my leg, and then we'll stand, and then we'll see what happens after he's already given me his best. And I think that that's what Islam is really going to face. I'm not saying he's going to have a problem with Volk. I think he will. I am saying that. He's definitely going to have a problem with Volk. Because he's going to show Volk his best, and Volk is going to say, is that all you got? And that's what Volk's known for. I think that is what Alexander Volkanovski is best at. He is best at withering the storm and then bringing on a storm that you did not think was comprehensible to even experience. So those are big factors that I think come into play when it comes to this fight. And another thing that comes into factor is that it's at the Perth Arena. It's in the Perth Arena at Australia. So, or it's at the Perth Arena in Australia. And that just brings into factor the whole entire aspect that Alexander Volkanovski is going to have a crowd behind him. And we saw Islam have a crowd behind him in Abu Dhabi in October. And I don't think it's going to be a big factor of saying that, yeah, that's going to get into Islam's head and that he's going to be a completely different fighter. But it is a thing to have in the back of your head to say, man, every time this guy hits me, this crowd is going to be insane, and I need to have the best concentration possible. And I'm not saying Islam doesn't have that, but I do think that that is going to be a thing that he's going to have to face that he may have not faced before. He's definitely had big fights. He's definitely, been in the big fights. In those big fights, though, he's had the crowd behind him. He's had a big audience. Alexander Volkanovski has a pretty fucking big audience. He has a pretty big fan base. He was in The Ultimate Fighter, the return of The Ultimate Fighter, the past a year ago or 2 years ago. So he's gained a following. He's got a YouTube channel. He's posting constantly on YouTube. So he's gaining quite the following. And the fact that it's in his hometown and the UFC hasn't been back to Australia in almost 2 or 3 years, I think that's going to be super big for his confidence. I already talked about how he was going to be going up in weight, and he already used to weigh 215 pounds and playing rugby. And usually you see fighters maybe struggle when they're going up in weight because the other person might be bigger than them, even with the weight cuts and everything. But I don't think we're going to see that here. I think we're going to see Alexander Volkanovski possibly be even more comfortable at 155. The dude used to play rugby at 215 pounds. I said it once and I'll say it again, but he ran through people. Literally ran through people. This isn't your ordinary jiu-jitsu practitioner who's used to rolling and scrambling. Nah, this dude is slam. This dude is run straight through you and keep on going. He's got a non-stop pace. I think it's a big thing to also think about that his gas tank hasn't been freaking tested in any of these fights. And we're talking against Max Holloway, where these guys are throwing 200, 300 strikes each. It's crazy to think about that this guy's gas tank has not really even been tested, or we haven't seen him go into deep waters. He has dominated almost every fight he's had as a champion. And I think that that is extremely respectable. And I think we're going to see Islam probably show a good amount of respect, and already has shown a good amount of respect leading up to this after he beat Charles Oliveira and had him come into the ring. Will we see that in the press conference? I'm not too sure. I know that a lot of fighters are going to be trying to build up hype for the fight. They're going to try and show a little bit of commotion. They're going to try and cause a little bit of commotion. So will that respect get lost come fight week? We will see. I don't know, but only Islam and Alex Volkanovski knows. I think we do know we're going to get it with Volk. We always see Volk be very respectable. And yeah, he'll talk some shit if he doesn't like someone. But Islam, he definitely will go a little far. He'll take a little jab or two when it comes to the mental game. And I think that's a big thing to think about. Another thing I want to bring up if Islam does beat Alexander Volkanovski, though, is this, just to put it into perspective, this is Alexander's past 5 to 10 fight, his resume right now, his fight resume in his last 5 to 10 fights. Max Holloway 3 times, the Korean Zombie, Brian Ortega, Jose Aldo, Chad Menendez, And it goes on, but those are just like the big names and recent fights. I'm not even talking about 2-3 years ago. I'm talking about recent fights. And he's just cleared the division. He's cleared it. All those guys are top 5 guys, and he's cleared them all. Not to mention going back and beating Max Holloway twice. Like, the dude's gone back and beat the freaking division twice. Like, come on. How can you not give... you gotta tip the guy. You just gotta tip it. You gotta tip it. There was something I wanted to bring up as well with that. It slipped my mind. Shite. Nah, it slipped my mind. I'm not gonna be able to rethink about it now. So we've also got the fact that Islam just beat Charles in the second round and dominated that. I mentioned that. And like I said, Charles Oliveira has more than one loss compared to Alex Volkanovski, who's only got one. Now, I don't know the exact details on that one loss that Alex has, but I do know that Charles, in the beginning of his UFC fight, he didn't have the same mentality that he has adopted now, that he has kind of forged now. And that is, not really giving up until it's, done and over with. And if you really want to look at it, he had him in a sort of triangle arm choke, Islam on Charles when he submitted him in October. And that's not the most frequent submission that you see guys tap out to. So I think that brings into play of that mentality that Charles Oliveira has, that Alexander Volkanovski, or that Charles doesn't have, that Alexander Volkanovski does. That mentality difference, I think, is where Alex has that advantage. And we're going to see Islam go up against that, and if he will be able to overcome that sort of mental barrier or not. Talked about that. The Russian Sambo, I think, is another thing to think about. With Charles Oliveira, you saw the background in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu go up against the background in Russian Sambo. Now, you saw Alexander Volkanovski's type of... I don't even know his grappling style, to be honest. He has... I don't know if it's wrestling. I don't know if it's more jiu-jitsu. I don't know if it's more judo. I really don't know his background when it comes to his grappling. I do know his striking is on another fucking level, obviously. And when it comes to the ground and pound, he definitely looks like he's comfortable on the ground. Now, when you see that style go up against Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, he had an answer for everything Brian Ortega threw at him in 3 or 4 different submissions. Brian Ortega put him in a freaking guillotine for 30 or 40 seconds, and Alexander Volkanovski figured out a way out. And let me tell you, that thing was locked in. It was locked in. And that's another thing the similarity I want to bring up. When you see Alexander Volkanovski get put into those waters, he's not going to tap. He's going to say, you've got me here. Either I'm going to get out or you're going to put me to sleep. So what are we going to see with that Alexander style type of grappling against that Russian Sambo background that Islam brings? I think it's going to be a very, very entertaining grappling fight, in my opinion. Yeah, we might see it on the ground or some striking on the feet, but I really think a lot of this is going to be on the ground. Now, I also want to bring in the fact that with the last UFC card, UFC 282, with... Who is the main event of that? How come I can't think of it? Oh my gosh. Oh, freaking Israel Adesanya versus Alex Pereira. That card just happened in November, and we had Chandler versus Dustin Poirier. I can't think of names right now. What the fuck? It's like I have an absolute brain fart right when I want to think about shit. Every time I want to think about things before the podcast, I'm like, yeah, I know that name. I know exactly when that happened. I hit record for the podcast, and I forget it all. So, that's the reason I like going over these podcasts, though, and going over these fights, because it's, just back to back to back. I'm not really cutting anything up. I'm just talking about shit kind of on the fly. And if, for those of you that don't know, that if you guys see something right here, it's just my laptop, just for the stuff that I want to talk about during this. And the thing I have next on my little cheat sheet is Chandler versus Jorge Masvidal, which we saw Michael Chandler just fight on that the co-main event, or the third fight before Israel Adesanya versus Alex Pereira. But honestly, possibly fight of the year. It was Michael Chandler versus Dustin Poirier, and it was one of the most bloodiest fights we've seen in probably the whole year. And I really want to say Michael Chandler looked like he was a better fighter in the first round or two, but then Dustin Poirier did what he always, or then Michael Chandler does what I think is predicted of him, what people make a fight camp. Everybody who is a somewhat of a UFC fan, who's watched the UFC in the past year or two, that's watched the Michael Chandler fight, they know that this dude has got strength. They know he's got skill. They know he's going to be explosive in the first round compared to any other fighter on the UFC roster right now. And if every UFC fan knows that, I'm sure these fighters going up against him are looking into that and making a strategy with looking into that. So I think that's what we saw in that fight. And I don't know if he's really going to be changing that style. I know Henry Cejudo talked about this, and I think it was a great point to bring up, where Michael Chandler is trying to be an entertaining fighter. He's not trying to be the most winning fighter. He's not trying to go into these fights and win. He's trying to go into these fights and get a paycheck, which you can make the argument winning leads to paychecks. But at the same time, if you look at his UFC career right now, he's had losses. He's had 2 or 3 losses, but still got paid a pretty good amount because it was a fight of the night, because he got performance of the night, because he gets these $50,000 bonuses, as well as having good pay-per-view buys. It brings a good amount of money. It brings good entertainment. And that is not something, that mentality is not the mentality that anyone can have if you're going to try and go for a belt. It's just not going to work out. You need to be trying to play more safe. You need to be having more situations where you're thinking things out, where you're trying to be more technical, where you're not just going for a knockout, where you're not just trying to showboat and slam someone and use all your energy in the first round by picking up someone literally all 150 pounds and then that's a lot of force. That's a lot of energy that you use when you do these types of moves that Michael Chandler is doing. And yes, it's entertaining. Don't get me wrong. That's why I watch the UFC. And that's also what I want to bring into my next point, is if he fights Jorge Masvidal, this is going to be supposedly, 2 of the more entertaining fighters. These guys bring more entertainment than they do the best technical fighting that, some people also look for. I think that there's entertaining fighters, and then there's really technical best of the best at their background, I should say. So, you have someone in boxing, or you have a striker who had a really good background in boxing, have that championship belt, and it hard for them to lose because they have that boxing background. At the same time, you see it with jiu-jitsu. Now, that's one aspect of a fighter, and then you have a mix of maybe striking and grappling, and maybe Muay Thai or something. That it's more of Muay Thai in general is a mixture of kickboxing. So when you have more of a mixture of let's say 3 backgrounds compared to just one, you might have a lot more of an entertaining fight compared to if you just had 2 people in their one background. Because those guys are just going to try and fight in their type of style. Compared to these guys maybe submitting over to the other person's style and still being a good competitor, them still having a good competition, even though they might not be at the same level in that one background. And I definitely think Michael Chandler has a little bit of that more of the entertaining aspect. And same thing with Jorge Masvidal. I don't think he necessarily was a boxer. He definitely has a striking advantage over against a lot of his opponents. But I think he got that mostly just from street fighting. And he definitely does have a good wrestling background as well. So maybe it might not be the top of the wrestling echelon, but it might be mid-tier, second to best. And that's where I think you get really these more entertaining fights compared to something that might be a little bit more slow or not as entertaining, but a lot more technical. And I think that because Jorge Masvidal had that, that's why you see a belt basically get created for him, with it being the baddest motherfucker belt. And that fight was Nate Diaz versus Jorge Masvidal for the baddest motherfucker belt. And I think you see Nate Diaz kind of adopt and create that baddest motherfucker mentality. And then you see Jorge Masvidal ended up in that day probably just being the baddest motherfucker. And with that, he keeps the belt and never shows it again. Now, would a baddest motherfucker do that? Probably not. I think there might be a little bit in that with Dana. But let me tell you, if there was a card that would be really good to see in the beginning of next year, I think for the baddest motherfucker belt, you have Michael Chandler versus Jorge Masvidal. 5 rounds. Go all out. I think we might see a little bit more of a prepared Michael Chandler. He might not go out in the first round like we've seen him do so many times. And we might see Jorge Masvidal back on the top. We might see him back in action. I think he had 3 losses in a row, or 2 losses and then a win and another loss. But he's definitely had a few losses in his past fights, as well as Michael Chandler. And I think that to elevate both of these fighters in audience, in getting people to pay for their fight, which I think they're already going to do. Any UFC fan that sees Michael Chandler or Jorge Masvidal fighting, they're probably going to watch the card. But just imagine, one, if it's for a belt, then you're going to get the casual boxing viewers that may not watch UFC all the time, but because it's for a belt, they'll watch. And then you'll get also any regular people that really don't watch fighting but are into sports. Oh, really big fight? I've heard of Jorge Masvidal before. I've heard of this Michael Chandler guy before. He's making a name for himself right now. Let me get this fight, especially because it's for a belt that we don't see a lot. If we see this baddest motherfucker belt once a year, I think that does bring the special type of feeling that you have fighting for that belt. And it's not just a belt that you can just throw around whenever you want. It's not a belt that's just going to be going from one guy to the next. I think you see the baddest motherfucker from the year before, and he challenges that baddest motherfucker that currently has the belt, that won it the year before, or that either defended it the year before or attained it that year, that same year that the other guy was making a name for himself as the baddest motherfucker. So let me put that into perspective as, a timeline that recently happened. And I don't think that the Nate Diaz versus Masvidal fight happened in 2021. At the same time, now that I'm giving it some thought, it might have. I can figure it out very quickly, though. Masvidal versus Nate Diaz. It was either in 2020 or 2021. I want to say it was 2021 because 2020 sounds a little bit... Wow, it was 2019! Damn, I thought it was after COVID. It was actually right before COVID in November, almost 3 years ago. So it's 2022 November right now, almost Thanksgiving, and they actually fought in the beginning of November in 2019. So it has been longer than 3 years now since they have fought, since the baddest motherfucker belt has been created, and we haven't seen it since. And we've seen very little of Jorge Masvidal in general since then as well. That is really when Jorge Masvidal was making a name for himself, and not even making a name for himself because he already did make a name for himself and he'd already been kind of a UFC vet. But he really started to pop and gain a lot of momentum and traction audience wise after that Ben Askren knockout and after this win specifically as well. Because then it was like, wow, this motherfucker is on his game right now. Like, talk about game bred. That motherfucker was bred for that shit. But that's really all I have on that. I really think it would be cool to see the BMF belt back into action, especially because it's been so long. I'd only thought it'd been a year or two since we've seen the belt, but it's actually been longer than 3 years. 3 years and a couple of spare days, or a couple days of spare change. But I really do think that would be an entertaining fight, especially for the beginning of next year, maybe January. I know that card probably wouldn't happen. And I really don't know what card they're going to put in for January just because there isn't that much time left. We've got 9 days left in this month, and Thanksgiving being this week, there's probably not going to be anything, or at least a lot of news released this week when it comes to fight week. So yeah, I think that's going to be interesting to see and even if it's not for the BMF belt, I think that's all right. But I do know Michael Chandler called out Jorge Masvidal, and Jorge Masvidal has been a little quiet recently. I know he hasn't been in the talks. His name has definitely lost a little bit of hype since he was last fighting in 2019 when he had all the hype in the fucking UFC. So that'll be an interesting fight, or it'll be interesting to see what happens with those two, whether they fight each other or whether they fight someone else. And another thing to wrap things up with that is Michael Chandler fights in 155, Jorge Masvidal fights at 170. So it's going to be interesting to see if that fight happens. Will Chandler be able to look as good at 170 compared to 155? I know that it can be harder for sometimes, or they might just kind of, meet in the middle, sort of. I doubt that. I doubt Jorge Masvidal would come down to 155, so I'd assume that fight would be at 170, especially because Chandler was calling out Masvidal, probably in inferring that he would, meet him at his weight class. And yeah, that's all I got to say about that fight. And I want to go next into the Jiri I'm gonna butcher his fucking name. Yuri, I gotta say it good once though. Prochazka. Prochazka. Something along the lines of that is how you say his last name. I'm just gonna go by Yuri. Or go for Yuri and Glover. All right, so we've got Jiri Prochazka versus Glover Teixeira coming up this December 10th, and I think it's going to be probably one of the most underrated cards this year, and that's just coming from someone who's been into the UFC the past 5 years. I've watched every single pay-per-view card, and I'll admit it. I didn't even watch the first fight. I did not. It was probably the first time in 2 years that I didn't buy a pay-per-view card for the UFC. And I can just say, number one, when Glover first got the belt, I didn't really know much about him. I didn't know the type of fighter he was. I didn't know his background. I thought he might have been a little bit of more grappling type of heavy fighter, which I definitely don't think I was wrong. At the same time, I then read Tim Kennedy's recent book, Scars and Stripes, and learned that Tim Kennedy used to train with these fucking gorillas that were fighting in LA or in California and or Nevada and Vegas. I think it was in California. But while Tim Kennedy was training at this one gym, they called it the Pit. You had guys like Chuck Liddell, Glover Teixeira, just absolute beasts when it came to top of the echelon UFC fighters. Just sparring, going as hard as you possibly could. Probably a lot of unsafe sparring compared to what you would see nowadays. And once I figured that out, I had to rewatch this fight because knowing Tim Kennedy and knowing Chuck Liddell and their type of fighting styles, they're just ruthless motherfuckers. These guys are killers in the cage. They're probably one of the nicest guys you'll see outside of the cage, but once they walk in there, it's a completely different mindset. It's a completely different mentality, and I saw it. I saw Glover Teixeira be in there and just turn into an absolute savage. This dude didn't care if you were his freaking brother, sister, mother, dad, cousin. He didn't care, dude. This guy, Jiri, looked like he was going to get his head taken off. That is the type of waters Glover Teixeira had him in. And that's not saying Jiri wasn't... He wasn't... I'm not saying he wasn't competitive. It was a very competitive fight. It was very back and forth. But every time Glover Teixeira took this dude down, it was very hard for him to get back up, as well as defend the ground and pound that Glover Teixeira was this dude was bringing down elbows, hammer fist, just absolute hell he was raining down. And I was all about it. I was fucking smile on my face, popcorn in hand, just bring it on. I really wished I watched it when it actually happened. When the first fight happened, I wish I watched it then when it actually first happened a year ago, or if not in the earlier in this year. I was kind of down on myself. I know the Glover Teixeira Jan Blachowicz fight. I actually watched that one, and it wasn't as entertaining. I know Jan Blachowicz definitely has that Polish power. At the same time, he can sometimes be a little bit boring on the ground. Not saying he doesn't bring entertaining fights, but he can sometimes be a little bit more stally or not do as much, not put as much pressure on the ground when he's on top. And that's what I thought I was going to get with some of this fight, especially because Jiri is known for his jiu-jitsu. And again, at the time, I was not practicing jiu-jitsu like I am now. So I didn't know as much about jiu-jitsu as I do now. Every time I see a fight go to the ground, I am absolutely eyes locked, entertained. I fucking love it. I almost prefer it to go to the ground, which I did before I was practicing jiu-jitsu, but it was harder for me to understand who was winning the fight and who had an advantage over the other person in certain situations. Now it's very, very, very easy for me to tell who's got the advantage, who's in the better position, who's possibly in a submission that can get them actually to submit, or if they can get out of the submission into something else and actually defend against it. So that is one of the differences in why I personally didn't watch the fight. I mean, other people, I'm sure they might have had their reasons. They could have been busy. They could have been, who knows, doing what. But let me tell you, I am watching the fight this December 10th. I watched that first fight. It was bloody. It was back and forth. There was huge strikes. So to put things into perspective, when I rewatched it, I actually wrote it down on kind of who I thought was winning the fight, and let me do a little breakdown of UFC, whatever it was. Jiri Prochazka. I never say it right. So real quick, let me do a breakdown of Jiri versus Teixeira, the first bout. The first bout, I want to say the first round went to Glover, but it could have went to Jiri. I really think Glover had more pressure on the ground and had more ground control in general. Teixeira definitely had some good stand-up in the first round. And you saw it later in the fight. Glover Teixeira did not want to stand up with Jiri. It was just that simple. Jiri was clocking him left, right combos, right hook, uppercut. It was absolutely beautiful to see. Stunned Glover a lot. And for being 42, I gotta tip it. Glover Teixeira still has a fucking chin at the age of 42, which I do not know if we've seen anyone take the shots that he took at the age of 42 and still be standing. And that was the first fight. Again, I had it going to Glover. You could probably give it to either fight, and that's just how first rounds usually go. Now, I roll with older guys in jiu-jitsu, in my jiu-jitsu gym nowadays, and even these guys say how they wish they started this or doing this back in the day because they had way more of a gas tank. Their cardio, as they get older, was just getting worse and worse and worse. And, now that they're doing jiu-jitsu, it's kind of balancing out. They're kind of maintaining it. But it wasn't like it used to be back in the day. And the fact that we still see Glover Teixeira go 4 or 5 rounds with a guy that's half his age, I think is very, very typical, especially when he's eating those shots. But at the same time, you do see Glover Teixeira tire out. You see a completely different Glover Teixeira in the second, third, fourth, fifth round. Maybe not necessarily the fourth and fifth, but definitely in the second and third, he was gassed. He put out a lot on the line in the first round, and in that second and third round, I think he was trying to regain a lot. He definitely put some ground and pound on, but I do think he was regaining a little bit. He did win the second and third round, maybe more the second compared to the third, because the third round, I think, is where Jiri started to gain some momentum. As well as in the first or second round, I think it was in the first because that was the first time Glover Teixeira took him down, Jiri stood up. And for those of you that don't know, when someone stands up, especially in a mixed martial arts fight, it's kind of impressive. It's a message to the other fighter. Everything you just tried to do, I knew what you were going to do, and I countered it and did what I wanted to do. You were trying to dictate the fight, and guess what? Now I am. Because we're standing, and that's where I think Jiri wanted to be. So, I think that was a confidence boost for Jiri, as well as just knowing when he's in those deep waters with Glover Teixeira on top of him, that, I'm going to be all right. I can get out of this. I've taken his shots before. I can do this again. And that just goes for, anything that you're doing. Any of you guys watching, sorry about my indigestion right there. Any of you guys watching, though, anytime you guys haven't done something, in general, whether it's going out and smoking weed, drinking alcohol, going to the gym, hitting a new PR at the gym, doing a type of workout, going on a 5-mile run and you've never done 5 miles before, after you go out and do it once, it all of a sudden becomes so much easier to do the second time. And that's coming from me rolling with jiu-jitsu, in figuring out moves, in me running 5 miles and never being able to do that, or never doing that before in my life until I was 18, 19 years old, thinking I can never run longer than a mile, 2 miles, and then I run 5 miles, and then I run 10 miles, and all of a sudden these barriers are broken down, and it becomes a lot easier to do these things that you may have not thought were possible for yourself. And I think that you saw that in that first round with Jiri, and throughout the fight, each time Glover gets him down, he seems comfortable. He seems calm. He seems like he knows that he's going to be able to get up again and put the fight back where he thinks it's more comfortable. And I also want to bring up the fact that Jiri was talking about him being one of the best jiu-jitsu practitioners in this division, being the light heavyweight division. And we did not see that. I mean, yes, we saw it in the fact that he could get up and that he could show good defense. And we saw it at the end in the 5th round when he put in the rear naked choke. But I think that Glover Teixeira has more of a grappling advantage. Now, I won't say necessarily better jiu-jitsu than Yuri because it was a lot more ground and pound, and this is the sport of MMA where when you get put on the ground, this is not just a grappling fight. These guys can throw punches, these guys can hit you in your ribs. They can try and they can put you into positions and try to get into positions differently than if it were just grappling. So maybe that's something that Yuri has to work on, but Glover Teixeira definitely has the experience on him when it comes to ground and pound. And I tried to bring it up earlier, and I think because why is that training with Chuck Liddell and Tim Kennedy in the pit, or whatever it was called when they used to train back in the day, and you just see that nowadays that's still that stuff that they practiced back then, the beginning of the UFC, still works to this day. That's why we see so many of the same positions people put into these days nowadays: mount, guard, ground and pound situations where throwing in elbows to then hammer fist to then putting someone into a headlock to keep control. It's stuff that you see that was figured out back then and still is used to this day, which I think is just goes to show the experience that Glover Teixeira has and brings to any fight that he's going to be in, as well as how good I think Yuri is and the adaptability he has when it comes to getting put into these types of fights. As well as you really see when it comes to the striking, how much faster he is and how much more better reflexes I think he has compared to Glover. So when it comes to the second fight, December 10th, I think things that we're going to have to think about when it comes to the first fight is Glover Teixeira was better on the ground and better at getting takedowns. That's another thing. Glover Teixeira would constantly, he had the most beautiful level change someone could have in mixed martial arts of going for a left, right, and then boom, going right for the takedown. Or just even fading left, right, and then going for a takedown. It was beautiful. It was a fast level change, and at the same time, unpredictable for Yuri to say, is he going to actually commit with the left, right, or is he going to commit with the takedown attempt? And that's where he got a lot of takedowns and put himself in a lot of good situations on the ground where he put in a lot of good ground and pound. And that's something to think about. Will Yuri have a better takedown defense to keep the fight standing? Because he obviously had better stand-up than Glover did. So who's going to come out on top when it comes to the second fight with trying to put the fight where they want to put it? Yuri wanting to put it in standing and Glover wanting to bring it to the ground. I think, it's up in the air. With me looking at it in the past fight, you're probably going to have to put your money on Glover just because he's that more experienced person. So, I think with that, will Glover win? I think I'll put my money on Glover winning, and then we see a trilogy fight, which is definitely going to be entertaining to see. If Glover wins, I'm definitely watching the trilogy fight because I think we're going to see a better Yuri in this fight, especially because he's still young and up and coming. And he's got a lot to learn, I think, when it comes to that ground and pound sort of defense. And what are we going to see come Saturday night, December 10th? It's going to be a big question. As well as we have Patty the Batty coming in hot against Jared Gordon. I don't know much about Jared Gordon, but I do know a little bit about Patty the Batty, my bro. He is over fucking 200 pounds right now. He's fighting at 170 or 155. And the fact that this dude is gaining that much weight and then cutting that much weight very fast in a very short amount of time, it's just not healthy. It's not safe. It's not healthy. It's not a good practice. If he could change it, I would. But if that's what the dude likes, to put a smile on his face, because I know when it comes to eating, a lot of fighters will have, sort of eating disorders or eating problems when it comes to really gorging themselves. And I definitely think Patty Pimblett is subject to that. I definitely think he falls into that category of having a little bit of an eating disorder after fight week or after winning, especially a big fight week. He'll go off the rails a lot of bit. Not a little bit, a lot of bit. The dude won't say, I'm going to have one slice of pizza. He's going to say, I'm going to have a whole fucking pizza. So I think that's going to be interesting. I do think it is a little bit more of a skill jump for Patty. I don't think it's the biggest skill jump. I don't think he's completely getting thrown into the fire with this fight. But Jared Gordon has fought, people like Charles Oliveira. And yes, he got submitted to him in the first round within the first minute and 26 seconds of the fight. But fighting someone like Charles Oliveira, that sort of fight camp gets you ready for someone that's good. Going through that fight camp is good experience. So I think that is going to be a factor in how good Jared Gordon is, as well as that Patty Pimblett has a lot of big fans and a lot of backing behind him and a lot of hype. So if you're smart, you winning that fight and you thinking you winning that fight, getting those fans and having that sort of crossover happening, it's definitely going to happen. Sean O'Malley, just because he fought and starched that one guy where he had the most significant strikes in UFC history, he gained like 100,000 followers just because he fought Sean O'Malley. So I'm sure just because this guy is fighting Patty, he's already gaining a following. So if he beats him, it's just going to cause a big commotion. And I think that is something that some of these fighters, when fighting a fighter that's bigger than them, that has a bigger following, that is a thing that you have to think about that can really help your career, that doesn't look like it's on the best trajectory right now. It just doesn't look like this Jared Gordon guy has proved himself or proved to the UFC that he's got what it takes to fight these big guys. And I think after this fight, we probably won't see a lot more of him, but probably a lot more of Patty the Batty, which I'm always down to see. And with that, I think that's all I have for you guys. I think I'm going to be wrapping it up there. I know that we have about a week or two before the December 10th card. So we've got 14 days before we got to start uploading, doing breakdowns and stuff like that. So definitely tune in this week. I have about 1 or 2 more videos I want to upload. One before Thanksgiving and one Thanksgiving weekend. So, try and plan your schedules around that. I know you guys are going to be busy this week with Thanksgiving. Have a great Thanksgiving. Eat fucking turkey. I know my favorite side dish is definitely going to have to be mashed potatoes and cranberry sauce. But let me know what you guys think about these fights coming up. Let me know who you guys think is going to win. Let me know who you guys want to see for this January card. Might it be Michael Chandler versus... I just forgot about one other fight I wanted to talk about, which was Dustin Gaethje... Or not Dustin Gaethje, just Dustin Poirier versus Beneil Dariush. That's a fight that I also wanted to talk about because Dustin Poirier talked about that in a press conference, as well as Justin Gaethje versus Beneil Dariush is another underrated thing to look at. But I'll talk about that in one of those videos I was talking about uploading later this week. And I'll let you guys go. Have a great Thanksgiving. Have a great motherfucking day. Let me know what you guys think about these fights coming up. I know the comments were very good in the last video. I appreciate you guys commenting. So again, like, comment, subscribe. Again, it really helps the channel grow. I comment back to every person that comments in the comments. I'm just going to stop talking right now because I have a problem closing out these videos. Oh, boy. That'll be it for that one.